Thanks very much for coming today. This is a really a great opportunity for all of us to listen to Professor Blank and to engage in a discussion, but it's been a lot of fun for me. Laurie is a friend and a colleague at Emory Law School, and we've done some projects together over the years, but she's never visited. And the fact that she offered to come in January to Syracuse.
I was out walking in the snow this morning.
She was. It's a testament to her determination to pay us a visit. Some of you know about the Carol Becker series on the Middle East that we've been running at INSCIT for the past few years. It's a great series that's underwritten by Maxwell Arts and Sciences alum Carol Becker, who's in New York City, who's had an abiding interest in issues in the Middle East, and was instrumental in allowing us to support the speaker series and some other activities that Carol was involved in with INSCIT, involving INSCIT's work in the Middle East. Laurie is an expert, and she was in Israel with us in September. Professor Sales was on this trip, and we had a great workshop there. But we were there in September, just a few weeks at the end of the last Gaza-Hamas war with Israel, and the subject of Laurie's talk today. Laurie is a professor of clinical law at Emory University, and she directs an IHL, International Humanitarian Law Clinic, really a unique clinic in American legal education that involves students working around the world remotely on actual cases and other matters before tribunals, NGOs, and the like in matters involving humanitarian law and human rights. She's the author of a new casebook on international law and armed conflict with Greg Noone, published by Aspen in 2013. She's also been involved in doing a lot of work in military training on the law of war, and has extensive experience lecturing and teaching in groups of JAGs and other military personnel in these issues. She's also, she is a prolific author and has many articles. I'm not going to recite them here today, but her work in this area of IHL and human rights law and other international law topics related to national security is really at the forefront of the field. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Laurie Blank to Syracuse. Laurie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to have a nice low podium, because sometimes I feel like I'm buried behind a podium. So anyway, thank you so much for having me. It's a real treat to get to come up and spend some time here, and also enjoyed working with Phil over the last few years. So what I want to talk to you today is about some interesting legal issues, some interesting issues that arise with the law that we see really highlighted from the conflict in Gaza last summer and past conflicts in that situation. We can see them arise in other conflict situations around the world, but this one is really a crucible for understanding some of these developments that are coming up. And it has to do with the integral role that legitimacy now plays in how we think about law and military operations. So we think about the stories we hear about the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Think about other conflicts, but this one is great because we have so many facts or purported facts at our disposal, right? There seems to be enormous amounts of information that people throw around. I think like anybody else, I don't really know all the actual facts because I'm not there, I'm not doing the investigations. We're operating based on news information, which, is as reliable as it can be, but there's always maybe an agenda there. So think about the predominant story. We hear about the numbers killed on each side. Now, of course, each of those numbers is a human being, right? So the numbers themselves is tragedy. But they're incredibly difference. Okay, we have over 2,000 on one side. We have 70, which doesn't seem like very much, but if you are familiar with Israel's conflicts, Israel's societies, it's an enormous number for this type of conflict. It was really significant. Then we can look at the extent of the destruction. You've seen the pictures from Gaza. Okay, there was a lot of destruction in Israel when rockets hit, but obviously nothing even comparable. The extent of the destruction in Gaza is astounding. We can look at the comparative capabilities. You have one of the most technologically capable and advanced militaries in the world. You have a terrorist group with actually quite a lot of firepower and quite a lot of manpower, right? But it's not an advanced military. So this seems to tell a story to most people right there. That seems to be the end. That's it. You package all that into a news story, into a commentary, and bam, you have the story of the conflict. We already know who did things right, who did things wrong. That seems to be all. But all this is using perception of what happened, effects, the effects like a Monday morning quarterbacking. What do we actually see as the result? To categorize and characterize legal compliance. So one of the things I want to talk about today is that those are exactly the things we should not use to characterize legal compliance. But what's particularly interesting is the role that discussion of legal compliance then has on legitimacy, on the rightness of one side or the other side. So this linkage between law and legitimacy is not new. Obviously, they're closely linked just as words, as language, as concepts. But in the area of conflict, legitimacy used to be about just war. Are you right in going to war? Are you an aggressor, meaning you're wrong in going to war? Are you the victim? You've been attacked, you're acting in self-defense, so therefore you're right in fighting. So it used to be all about the use of force, the resort to force, and who had the legitimate right to use force. So we can go way back, look at just war theory, but this was generally the story when we talked about legitimacy in military operations. Now, story has changed. The story is about compliance with the law of war, with the conduct of military operations. This is new. I mean, this, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, it's new. I would say it's a 21st century issue, although, we can trace it back a little bit farther than that. But what it's really about is the perception of law of war compliance. Because there's so much, as we'll see throughout the course of our discussion, there's so much that we don't know that is integral to understanding the extent of law of war compliance. So we're looking at the conduct of military operations, and because of significant challenges about the nature of the discourse, about the presentation of information, about access to information, we see absolutely enormous consequences for legitimacy. So what does all this mean, bigger picture, for the law of war, for implementation of the law of war, and for discourse about the law of war? And we can look at this specifically in the context of the conflict last summer, Operation Protective Edge. We can look at it even beyond the law. We can look at it in the context of strategy, in how we think about military operations. We can think, what does it mean to be able to say you're declaring victory when legitimacy seems to be so much more dominant in terms of who comes out the winner? From the military's perspective, the mission is to win the war. You have an objective. There's a reason you're fighting. We assume it's a lawfully justified reason, but we can leave that aside. It's not about winning a narrative, right? That's the public affairs job. But here, especially in that context, but in other contexts, winning the narrative seems to be key to winning the war. It seems to end up being the story. And just as one little piece of that, actually winning a war is pretty awful looking. I mean, it's not pretty, right? Even if you do it in the most law-compliant way, there's death, there's destruction, there's injury on both sides. In today's world with 24-hour news, or maybe 24-second news, it's so fast. We have news before we actually know what the news is, right? So we have information, but maybe we don't have news. oftentimes what winning a war looks like, what fighting a war looks like, it just looks criminal to all of us who are watching, right? Dead people, destroyed things, people are hurt, hospitals maybe were bombed, whatever it is, right? It looks bad. It always looks bad. That's one reason why people have struggled for years to outlaw war altogether, right? It's not a positive environment. So what I want to do is give a little bit of background for this discussion, and then I want to dive into some of the key challenges that this focus on legitimacy, this marrying of law of war compliance and legitimacy creates. Because what interests me is the law and how it's being applied and how it's being talked about. I think legitimacy obviously is important. It has huge consequences for strategy and politics and things like that. But what I'm interested in is this following this path where we start with law, we move to legitimacy, and then what impact does that have back on the law? Because then that's going to impact the actual purpose of the law, the people it's trying to protect, the people who are trying to implement it and use it. And if it begins to change, well, we can see real consequences. So 2 areas that I want to give a little bit of background in that are obviously relevant to this discussion. One is what's called the jus ad bellum. That's the law that governs when you can go to war, sort of the just war theory. And the other one is the law of war, the law of armed conflict. That's going to be the law that tells us whether the conduct of military operations is lawful, how you can do things, who you can target, what kinds of things you can target, when, how, under what circumstances. And then it's the way these two get mixed together that often has a lot to say in this legitimacy story. So just very quickly, because I'm guessing there's a mix of experiences here in this area. The jus ad bellum, that's the international law that says when a state can go to war. It's based on the UN Charter and lots of history behind it. But in essence, the idea is to try to outlaw war, to try to minimize state resort to force. So the Charter of the United Nations prohibits the use of force by one state against another, except it gives a couple of exceptions. Why does it give exceptions? Well, in general, a rule without exceptions is a hard one to follow. It doesn't tend to have a lot of bite. And states also place, obviously, understandably, quite a lot of weight on being able to protect their people, their territory, their sovereignty. So there needs to be some framework that makes sense. So, customary principle is that a state can use force inside the territory of another state with its consent. Okay, that's one important but not that relevant to our discussion. Another one in the UN Charter is a state can use force if the UN Security Council authorizes it. Again, relevant, important, doesn't happen very often. If you look at the makeup of the Perm 5 of the UN Security Council, you can see why it doesn't happen very often. And again, not relevant to our discussion today. The last one that's important is self-defense. And just very quickly, a state can use force in self-defense if it's been the victim of an armed attack, which has a particular definition, or an imminent armed attack, it's about to be attacked, and it must do so. If it's going to respond to this attack, it must do so and comport with a couple of key principles. The first one is necessity, which says there's no other way to stop the attack. There's no non-forceful means you can use. The second one is proportionality, which says that the amount of force used must be proportionate to the goal of ending the attack. It's not tit for tat. It's not he used tanks, I can use tanks, or nothing more. It's what do I need to do to stop this other group, state, whatever it is, from their attacks on me. I may have to do a whole lot more than they did to me. I may only need to do less than they did. It depends on the situation. The last one is immediacy. It has to be closely related in time. You can't wait 5 years and then decide, now I'm going to attack. That's just retaliation. So that's that framework, very quickly. You could obviously spend an entire law school semester on what all that really means. But that's the idea that there is, in fact, a framework for when a state can go to war, when they can use force. So what about the law of war? The law of war doesn't tell us anything about when you can go to war, which may be tricky from its title. but it's about the law in war. That's really what it should be called, the law during war. And here we have an enormous amount of law, which I think is interesting given that this is maybe the most violent, most chaotic situation that human beings find themselves in. And many people probably think it's entirely unregulated, but in fact, it is absolutely an incredibly robust body of law. What is its purpose? Its purpose is threefold: to protect civilians from the dangers, the hazards, from suffering during war. Fundamental purpose. That is its absolute most central goal. Okay, the idea is that two states or two groups are fighting for a purpose. Okay, but the uninvolved people should not be harmed. They should not be caught up any more than they have to be. So the goal is the people who are fighting, they can fight it out, but leave everybody else safe and secure. Second purpose is to minimize unnecessary suffering for those who are fighting. So we have some rules about how actually soldiers and other fighters have to be treated, have to behave. Certain weapons can't be used because they cause superfluous injury, unnecessary suffering. The last purpose, and this one is also really important, is the law is designed to enable effective military operations. It's designed to make it possible to fight. This is not law that outlaws war. This is law that says, we have war, so let's make it as protective, as effective as possible. Why? We want to have a sustainable peace afterwards. We don't want people who don't need to be harmed to be harmed. We want to make it possible afterwards so that societies can recover, regenerate, rebuild, and hopefully work together. So, couple of key principles that are going to come up in the conversation here. And then I want to talk about the relationship between these two bodies of law very quickly. The first one is military necessity. Okay, this is a principle of authority in the law of war that says that parties to a conflict can use whatever force is necessary to achieve the complete submission of the enemy as quickly as possible, as long as it's not forbidden by the law. That is pretty robust authority. The complete submission of the enemy. Think about what those words mean. But you cannot violate the law, right? So it has a constraint built in. The principle of humanity seeks to minimize suffering in war. Third principle is distinction. This one is very important in this particular conflict and in all conflicts, which is that those who are fighting must distinguish between the enemy personnel on the other side and the civilians. And you can only attack the enemy personnel or military objects. And the last one is proportionality. So forget what I said before about proportionality. I'm going to tell you about a different kind. And proportionality seeks to minimize incidental harm to civilians. It's an additional layer of protection for civilians during conflict. And what it says is when launching an attack, you must assess the likely civilian harm from that attack. And if that's going to be excessive, given what you're going to gain militarily, you can't launch the attack. Okay? You're attacking something lawful. You're not trying to attack civilians. You're attacking a lawful target. You have to take into account incidental, what they call collateral damage, and try to minimize it. Now, what's really important to this discussion and plays a really important role in the legitimacy issue is that this idea of war limiting the resort to war at all, the use ad bellum, has to be separate from the law that tells how you can behave during wartime. Why is that? Well, this is a very long-standing principle. They call it a strict separation between these two bodies of law. And I can just give you one example. Imagine a country that's been attacked, so it's going to respond in self-defense. If it says, I'm right, so I don't have to follow the law, right? I'm justified, so I don't have to worry about following the specific rules about how I fight, about following the law of war. What happens to all the people who get caught up in that suffering, right? The central purpose is defeated because nobody's protecting those innocent civilians. Nobody's protecting the hospitals, the churches, the mosques, the cultural property. Or what about the country that's an aggressor? Germany, Japan. We have a current version with Russia, right? Their soldiers are acting on behalf of the state. Their soldiers didn't make the decision to launch an aggressive war. They're acting as the agent of the state, right? They should still be entitled to all the protections that the law of war offers, prisoner of war status and treatment if they're wounded, etc. They should not all of a sudden lose all those protections because their government chose to launch aggressive war. Otherwise, you're treating them all as criminals when they have not done anything to merit that. So this separation is really important. The legitimacy discussion tends to merge these together quite a lot, which is interesting and highly problematic for how we think about both bodies of law. One thing I think that's interesting to think about as we talk about legitimacy and we talk about how it marries up with law of war compliance, I was thinking about this yesterday is, well, what is legitimacy? I know what I think it might be, but each group, legitimacy is something very different. So for Israel in this conflict and in others, legitimacy for them depends on two things. Depends on the perception that they have complied with both of these bodies of law. So two separate perceptions. Have they acted in self-defense, or are they seen as an aggressor? Because if they are perceived to be an aggressor, they are never going to have legitimacy. Because launching aggressive war is illegal, as we want it to be. Are they perceived to be acting in compliance with the law of war in the way they conduct military operations? That is the absolute crucial piece for their legitimacy. You can almost watch these conflicts. I pay close attention watching the Israeli press during the conflict, and I can sort of see, and there's always going to be one incident that happens. You guys may remember the incident of the 4 boys who were tragically killed on the beach. The Israelis are investigating. It appears to be a mistake, but we'll see what they come up with. Something like that happens, and you can immediately see this is going to start a snowball in the discussion, right? That's where you see legitimacy come right in. Something like that happens. So now think about the other side, Hamas and the other groups in Gaza. What is legitimacy for them? For legitimacy for them depends on people thinking Israel's acting unlawfully, right? They want the exact opposite. They also want to be seen as attacking under all circumstances, right? Defending their people, their cause, regardless of legal parameters. So we have two very different ideas of legitimacy for both groups, which of course leads to totally different conduct, totally different behavior, different responses to public discourse. So in the end, right, we could talk about legitimacy, we could flip this around and have a different conversation depending on what we think legitimacy means. So 3 areas that I think are really important for this discussion. One is, which things are legitimate targets of attack, are what we call military objectives? Which things are okay to attack during conflict, and particularly in a place like Gaza? The second one has to do with harm to civilians, and that's this question of proportionality, collateral damage, incidental harm, whatever you want to call it. And that's really important because that's where so much of the discussion comes about. I'm sure you've all seen commentary, either oral, written, where you see 2,100 people killed in Gaza, 75 people killed in Israel. Well, clearly, who's right and who's wrong? That's the sum of that discussion. That's making a proportion between those two numbers and saying, well, clearly more people died here, so they must have suffered more, so the other side must be wrong. But the law actually has nothing to do with that, and that has nothing to do with the law. The last one has to do with the role of information. As we live in this world where information is flowing so quickly, and how do we deal with it? So the first one, military objectives. Well, the law says that a lawful military objective is anything that by its nature, location, use, or purpose makes an effective contribution to military action, and that destroying it, capturing it, or neutralizing is going to offer a definite military advantage. So, some things are easy. Tanks, rocket launchers, enemy weapons storage facilities, depots, other equipment, right? Okay, now we can get a little more complicated. What about a restaurant that's used as a command post for the other side? What about houses where weapons are being stored? What about hospitals where rockets are being launched from the roof? Right? So it can be a lot more complicated. We unfortunately live in a world where using the civilian population in the civilian arena as a shield, right, as a hiding place, right, has become very effective. So certain places are protected and have additional protection. All hospitals are specially protected. All cultural and religious property, mosques, synagogues, churches, other designated cultural property, all have special protection. Beyond just being civilian, they have special protection. But they can lose that protection, right? Anytime used for military purposes. So imagine a school bus, it drives kids to school. Clearly not being used for military purposes cannot be attacked. Well, what if that school bus is being used to drive fighters or troops to the front lines, to the extent there are front lines, right? So think back to ancient conflicts where there were front lines. Now that school bus is a legitimate target. School bus finishes, goes to take kids to school, it's not a target anymore. It can't be attacked. Well, what if you have a whole parking lot of school buses? Where I live, we have these parking lots where the school buses go to sleep at night while they're waiting to pick up the kids. And you know that all they're being used for is driving soldiers or driving fighters. They're not being used for kids. Then their intended purpose is for military use. Nobody else is there. Again, they could be attacked. So we have to understand what's happening at the time. Well, we end up with situations in a place like Gaza where there are so closely together, right? We have schools, mosques, hospitals, other things being used to store weapons, to launch rockets, for command posts, people's houses, right? Tunnels built right under houses, built right under mosques. I'm sure you all have seen the coverage in the news. So now what do? Right? This is much more complicated. Well, let's look at the after effects first. The after effects are, we see a mosque that's destroyed. We see a hospital that's been damaged because the shells were attacking fighters or rocket launchers right next to it. We see a school where people are taking shelter and there are injuries from artillery shells. That looks bad. There's no doubt. You think hospital, that's where people are treated when they're sick. How can you possibly attack it? But now we have to look at it from the perspective of the actual military operation that's going on. So that's what's so important about the law of war, is it is a prospective analysis based on what the commander knew or should have known at the time. So now imagine that you have 2, 3, 4, however many Hamas fighters, enemy fighters who are launching a rocket from the schoolyard or are firing at your forces who are searching for a tunnel. Okay? Now you need to get your forces out or provide cover so that they can continue their mission. You have to take out the rocket launcher that's launching rockets maybe at your civilian, or the fighters who are firing at your forces, or firing mortars at your forces. Now a decision has to be made, right, about the situation and what's the likelihood of damage to this non-military site that might be nearby, or this object is now a military target because it's being used for military purposes. So, but all that doesn't come across, right, in the public discourse. It doesn't come across in the news. And one of the things here that's missing is the complexity of military operations and what it really is, what it means to try to target things, defeat the enemy, proceed with a mission through a heavily populated area where the enemy is hiding in the civilian population. And that's very difficult to communicate. And so we end up having a great challenge because perception ends up driving the discussion. And one thing that can be really interesting is to think about, how do you communicate why something is a military objective? So it's easy to say, okay, there were there were rockets stored under this mosque. Well, what does that mean? Why is that important? Well, let's think back to the objectives of the mission. And one of the key objectives in this particular operation was to destroy Hamas's capability to launch rockets at Israel because those rockets are launched at civilian areas, right? So in order to protect your own civilians, the state's maybe fundamental job, right? You want to stop the other side's ability to launch those attacks. Well, you can't only stop it when they're actually attacking. You don't stop their capability only by attacking their personnel. You have to also take out their capabilities, their actual equipment. So now, right, we can think about the importance of different situations. Why do you need to take out a rocket launcher? Well, right, that's their equivalent of maybe a tank or whatever else. That's their main method of attack. You need to take those out. So we think about what it means. Why don't you just go take the rockets out of the mosque? Why do you have to destroy it? Well, it's not that easy to go just insert a unit into an area and take rockets out of a mosque when you now have to fight your way through the area. Think about the extent of the damage, right, that would actually be incurred as a result of using that method. And so, right, we want to think about all the different alternatives here. And this is a real challenge. I want to raise an example from a totally different conflict. I was just looking at the news before I came in here, and there's a story about the shelling of a bus stop in Ukraine, in the town of Donetsk, right by the airport. So they've been fighting over this airport for months now. We'll see how significant it ends up being by the time they're done fighting over it, at which point I'm not sure what use it will be. So I read the first paragraph or two, and it says 13 people were killed when a bus was shelled at a bus stop by the airport in Donetsk. Well, that sounds really bad. But I don't know actually anything about who those people were, why they were there, whether the bus itself was the target of the attack, whether the shell was errant and was supposed to land 150 meters away, whether it was collateral incidental harm from something else, whether there were fighters nearby that were actually the target of attack. We don't actually know anything. And so it's very difficult to actually comment other than to say, that's tragic. There's no doubt. We know there's one conclusion that we can reach, but it's very hard to reach a legal conclusion without more information and without knowing what the actual person who launched that shell knew or should have known at the time. So this brings us to the issue of proportionality. And again, just to reiterate what the principle says is that when launching an attack, you have to refrain from any attacks where the expected civilian casualties will be excessive in relation to the anticipated gain you're going to get militarily. This is prospective. This is look at the situation at the time you're launching the attack, and what do you know about the value of the target? Is it important? What's it going to get you? How does it fit in with the rest of what you're doing? And what do you know about the civilian population in the area? Their patterns of movement. Who's there? What about the weapon you're using? How much blast radius? What else is it going to harm? Right? Is the building next door going to be harmed also? Or maybe you have something that's going to have a very small blast radius and not have any additional effects. What choices do you have in that respect? And so what's important here is that the law recognizes and accepts that some civilian casualties are an inherent consequence of war. And that in and of itself is not illegal. The simple fact that there are civilian deaths does not mean a crime has been committed. That's the first thing, right? The idea that you only refrain from attacks where the civilian casualties will be excessive. Now, there can be situations where one civilian death would be excessive. There could be situations where hundreds would not be. It depends on the situation, the nature of the target, the value of the target, and so many other considerations. But if we look at the discourse, the immediate starting point for our public discourse about civilian deaths during conflict is that the very existence of civilian deaths creates a prima facie evidence that there was a disproportionate attack launched. Now, we have lots of situations around the world, unfortunately, where the very existence of civilian deaths is pretty clear evidence that atrocities were committed. So when we have groups I think Boko Haram went into a village. They killed 2,000 people. I don't know, but I don't think there were even any fighters, Nigerian forces or anybody else, right? That was essentially a terrorist attack, right? Killing civilians to eliminate them, right? To make a point, to prove some political point or purpose. So that's a different story. But when we're talking about complex military operations, one side fighting against another side, and civilians are in the area, now we start to see these legal principles really put to the test. And here we see lots of things that impact legitimacy. The first thing is this idea that it's prospective and not retrospective. So it's very easy to engage in an effects-based analysis. 9 people died, therefore it must have been illegal. Well, I don't know. Did the commander who launched the attack expect 9 people to die? Did they take a look to see who was there? Did they do any kind of pattern of life analysis? If they didn't look at all, well, then they failed in their obligation to begin with, to take precautions, to gather information. Let's say they looked and they really tried to gather information and they had a pretty good understanding, except that they were mistaken. There were some children. There was something going on that they could not have known. Well, then they can't be blamed for that, because you have to look at it based on what they knew or should have known. We don't know anything about the enemy's tactics if we only look at effects. We don't know anything about the weather, so many other things that could have impacted the nature of the attack and the impact of the shell or rocket or whatever else was used. So this raises a lot of challenges. Another piece here that really impacts legitimacy is how we have the same word, proportionality, in both bodies of law. One talking with when you can use force, and one talking about how you use that force when you're in a war, when you're in an armed conflict. And we end up with a very problematic conflation between the two bodies of law. And we end up with claims that what appears to be a disproportionate attack under the law of war, using this idea that, wow, a lot of people died, therefore it must have been disproportionate, regardless of the actualities of the situation. Now people then will say, well, this must mean the entire military operation, the entire war is disproportionate and therefore illegal. Boy, have you just jumped a whole chain of connections, starting from some faulty analysis at the beginning through many other faulty connections, and we're in a different ballgame altogether. This is kind of the flip side of those traditional arguments that, well, we're acting in self-defense, so we don't have to worry about the law. We can justify killing lots of civilians on the other side. The sort of Crusades argument, basically. So we look at numbers only, we look at effects only. That in and of itself is highly problematic, but it takes us to a really significantly more problematic place. Another piece here with proportionality that comes up is, what about the impact of warnings? Right? States are parties to a conflict are obligated to provide effective advance warning to the civilian population where feasible. So if you're launching a surprise attack on a particular military objective, the warning kind of defeats the surprise attack aspect, right, of your plans. But where feasible, you have to provide effective advance warning. What does that mean? It means information so that civilians can seek safety. It doesn't mean you tell them the exact time and location necessarily, although we see that happen. It could be radio announcements, it could be leaflets, it could be all kinds of general warnings. But it is important to provide information so that people can seek safety. Because again, what is the key purpose here? Protecting civilians. But then we begin to see this mixed in, right? Well, warnings were provided, people still died, so therefore you must have meant to kill them. That's an immediate leap, jumping over lots of connections, at least for me, without having that information. So let me turn to the third point here, which is information and the role of information here. And this just highlights some of the challenges with, implementing the law, talking about the law, particularly from the perspective of the military, that is now faced with a situation where, in addition to dealing with how do you defeat the enemy strategically, operationally, tactically, how do you comply with the law, how do you protect people in the course of all of these operations, they're now looking at all these questions of legitimacy all at the same time, which adds a layer of complexity to their decision making. The information then just exacerbates that. States have essentially lost control over the gathering and dissemination of information and the means of that dissemination, right? We're in an age where a single cell phone and you have news. You're a reporter. If you have a cell phone with a camera, you are now a reporter in essence. So this is a big challenge. Is it good at the broad scheme that we have more information and greater ability of dissemination and greater freedom? Sure, that's absolutely. I think as we look long term, right, big picture, more information is good. But the challenge when information leads to all these other steps, right? Discourse about the law that's not correct, jumping right to legitimacy questions is a big challenge. In essence, it's like the genie that comes out of the bottle. It's really hard to put it back in. Once that information is out, you can never put it back in. So perception becomes the dominant force here. As one person wrote, in the end, civilian casualties are not just a moral issue, right? Because ultimately, you want to limit those as much as possible, not just for legal reasons, but for moral and humane reasons. But they constitute a front in a social media contest over justice and credibility. And I thought that really sums up so much of the situation, so I didn't want to take credit for that, read you exactly what somebody else wrote. And I think this raises some really interesting challenges. So what does this mean for the law? So I can wrap up here. And I think we have some real challenges about, as we go from law to legitimacy and then we flip back to law, what impact that has on the law. Is the law going to change? And is it going to change in good ways or bad ways? And I think this may depend a little bit on your perspective and on what you consider perhaps to be the dominant considerations. But I would challenge that a little bit. And I would say, let's think about the central purpose of the law here, which is to protect people during conflict. That's what it's all about. It's about protecting people. So now what happens? What does this emphasis on legitimacy do to that purpose and to the ability of law to do that? So I'll raise a couple of things here. When we end up with a scenario in which effects dominate our legal analysis, our legitimacy considerations, we end up with a situation in which one side is incentivized to create all of those effects. Right? To create more and more destruction, more and more civilian casualties. Because it makes the other side look bad. It makes them look unlawful. It makes them look aggressive, immoral, pick your word, illegitimate, right? Delegitimization. So as soon as we focus on effects, we open the door for that to happen. So that's why we see rockets in mosques. That's why we see rocket launchers in the courtyards of schools. Not because it happens to be a really good storage place. There's lots of basements, right? It's not that a mosque has a particularly great rocket storage rack or whatever it is you want to use, right? It's because it's protected from attack. It's because either your rockets will be safe because the other side won't attack it because mosques are protected, or when they do attack it, they're going to look much worse. You're going to look bad for storing the rockets in the mosque, maybe, but they're the ones who destroyed it. It's got to be worse, right? So what do you accomplish? You delegitimize them. Not an easy word to say, right? Because you make it look as if they're being unlawful. Why do you, right, shoot rockets from schoolyards or any of these other things? Because the school may get damaged, children may get hurt, all of these things, again, continually build on that delegitimization. So once that happens, what happens to the law? Well, first, the law is not doing its job, right, of protecting those sites and those people because it's the discourse is incentivizing that behavior. But also, What if now the law becomes an effects-based approach? What if that's now how we actually apply the law? Think about the ability to implement it. How do you implement law as a commander, trying to comply with the law, but also trying to fulfill your military mission? You have an objective. You're trying to protect your people, your territory, whatever it is. How do you comply with a law that says, if you miss, you're a criminal? If you were wrong, if you were reasonable but wrong, war crime. I don't know how you comply with that. How do you implement that? It's a strict liability standard in a world with so many factors that are going to impact what happens, that in essence, your choices are going to be, oh, well, the law was nice. It was great back then, but now it doesn't work, so forget it. Put your law books back on the shelf. I don't need my judge advocate. I'm just going to do this the old-fashioned way, you know? Or I'm not going to carry out my mission. I'm going to go back and tell my leaders, I'm sorry. I cannot actually fulfill the task you've given me because I have no ability to do it within the bounds of the law. Neither of those is a good choice. They both end up leading to more damage and more harm to civilians. The first one means the civilians caught up in the war area. I mean, it's unregulated warfare. That's a disaster for anybody in the area. The second one means the people who you're sworn to protect, they're left unprotected. So the state has failed there as well. So these are two really challenging conceptions. And I think instead we really need to remember that law is methodology. Law is a system for how we should behave, and particularly in this area, whether it's proportionality or precautions or the law about what is a legitimate target, a military objective. This is a methodology for how you conduct operations. It's not a set of rules that we just drop on afterwards, right? This tells you how you do it. Here's how I start. Here's what I need to find out. Here's the information I need. Here's how I apply that information. Here's how I act on it. That may have to happen in 4 seconds. Maybe you don't have days to consider, depending on the nature of the target. But it's a methodology, right, of how to behave lawfully and humanely and morally in conflict. So with that, I open it up to any questions.
Thank you. This is great. Questions?
Yes.
Hi. First, let me say thank you for the service that you did over the summer in helping so many people to understand these issues with your op-eds and blogs. But I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate. I'm very sympathetic to your position, but I'm a political scientist, so I come at these issues a little differently. I mean, one of the telling things during the Gaza summer conflict was that Hamas never moved to the underpopulated areas of Gaza to fight. So it obviously invites the harm to its citizens, and I think you established that in the talk today, and we have all the evidence. So it wants the harsh countermeasures, and that's in a sense what all terrorist organizations do. They invite the enemy to be brutal. So my question is, why do states constantly fall into the trap that terrorists set for them? Why not make the terrorists look unlawful and delegitimate by not responding with full guns? And I guess my question is, could Israel have handled this any differently? That is, could Israel have complied with the LOAS, but done that and still provided security for citizens, so that it could have won not just tactically, which I think it did win tactically in the short term, but could have also won in every other way. So that's one question, and I don't know, your thinking on that, but the second question is more of a legal question. So that's your bailiwick, not mine. So you said that the state's fundamental job is to protect its own citizens. But Mike Walzer over the summer raid in a couple of op-eds he did said maybe there are other jobs that the state needs to do in a globalized society, that maybe maybe it should take on more risks to its own armed forces in order to protect the citizens of another state or another under another governance, as the civilians of Gaza are under Hamas governance. So my question is, when I saw his commentaries was, well, legally, what obligation does Israel have currently to civilians in Gaza? It's under siege, so it provides electricity, food, for years before this current summer conflict. In the past, I think the IDF did take on more risk to its soldiers by putting troops on the ground that protected civilians more, but with air power, and I think that's the move, just in general in counterterrorism, is air power and drones, and you're protecting your own soldiers, protecting your own citizens, but aren't you causing more harm to civilians out there? I'm not sure that's the moral answer. I don't know if it's the legal answer.
No, two great questions. Let me take them in reverse. So I'll tackle the legal one first. So when I say state's first job is to protect its own citizens, that's my political science statement, right? What is the role of a state in the international system? In some essence, states are a little bit like kids on a playground. This stuff is mine. Don't come and take it, and if you do, I'm gonna hit you, right? We're gonna duke it out. I think a lot of international relations makes a lot of sense when you think about states in that respect. At least for me, it does. But that may just be because I have a couple of small regrets. So now, when we talk about war, states absolutely have obligations to the civilians on the other side. The obligation to protect civilians under the law of war is regardless of what their nationality is. So when we think about targeting, right? Now, there are rules in terms of detention, in terms of other things that will differ based on where the person is, whether you're in occupied territory, who they belong to, etc. But when we talk about targeting, because that's what we're talking about here, we're talking about the conduct of hostilities, all civilians are protected. It doesn't matter who they are. And the enemy's civilians, or the civilians living in the area, right? Because you don't want to think about them as enemies, it's the other forces who are enemies, right? They are equally entitled to all the same protections as your own. So when you have to distinguish between who's fighting and who's not, that principle applies to everybody. When you take into account proportionality, when you take precautions, that applies to everybody. I would raise, interestingly, there's another obligation towards civilians that is not applied equally here at all, and that's the obligation as the defending party, not the one launching the attack, but the one in the area where the attack is going to land, right? That party has obligations to take precautions to protect civilians. They need to not locate military objectives in densely populated areas. They need to move civilians, where feasible, out of areas where military operations. Not talking about mass deportations, but to the extent that you can move your own people to safety, you need to do that. You need to take other measures to protect the civilian population. Hamas doesn't do any of that. In fact, they often do the opposite. So this is a two-sided game here, right? Both sides have obligations. With regard to the amount of risk, et cetera, I did see some of those pieces, and I think that's an interesting question. I mean, but to me, it's a moral question. It's not so much a legal question, because the obligation is to implement the law effectively and to take the measures you're required to take. Like, parties are supposed to take constant care during military operations to ensure that civilians are not harmed or put in danger. That's not just attacks, right? Military operations is really broad. You want to roll your tanks down through the city? Well, you don't just charge over people's gardens or, whatever, to the extent that you can try not to harm people in the course of military operations. So there's lots of obligations. The amount of risk, I would challenge that discussion simply by saying we don't know what the alternatives were to any given tactical choice. Okay, the soldiers who went into Gaza faced level of danger that we can't grasp here in this room. in order to locate a tunnel. You don't locate a tunnel with air power, right? You have to send people in. You have to find the tunnel and all the entrances, and you have to destroy it. Now, maybe you call in airstrikes to destroy the building where the tunnel opening is, but in order to find it, right? Now, imagine that in the process of that tactical maneuvering through a heavily populated or very dense area, right, you are being fired at from all around by fighters located in different civilian buildings. In order to get from A to B, you need cover, or you need to have your air support neutralize that threat. So there could be so many reasons, right, why we see a mix of air power. Air power is not only used against targets that are planned way in advance. That's their intelligence headquarters, and that's this, and that's that, and now we just line them up and take them out with air power. Air power is used integrally mixed in with ground troops in order to provide support, to help them carry out their mission. So we really don't know what risk would have been in another situation. As far as, are you obligated to put your troops on the ground? What about Kosovo? Okay, we did not put any troops on the ground in Kosovo. In fact, our air sorties were flown at a very high altitude in order to stay above the range of any Yugoslav, now Serbian, still Yugoslavia then, sort of, surface-to-air defense. And there were criticisms. There were a lot of criticisms of NATO saying you flew too high, therefore you couldn't distinguish the targets, and so therefore people died as a result. Well, when you talk to some people in the Air Force, what they'll tell you actually is it's actually easier to identify the targets based on the particular technology that's being used, sometimes from a higher altitude. Sometimes you fly, certain altitude is too low, you can't actually use your instruments effectively and all of your surveillance technologies to identify the target correctly. So in fact, by flying at X thousand, tens of thousands of feet, we were in the ideal spot to carry out the obligation of distinction. So there's so many considerations. I would not have known that had I not read that, heard that perspective. Otherwise, the other side's claim makes a lot of sense. Wow, you flew really high to protect yourselves. You should have flown lower so you could have gotten shot at. You know, why are you using drones instead of manned aircraft? The question is, can you carry out the legal obligations? Can you make sure you distinguish? So in that respect, it's hard to comment on that question of how much risk. There's no obligation to put your soldiers at risk, but you certainly can't decide to just drop a 2,000-pound bomb on a tiny little target and kill hundreds of civilians because you didn't want to worry about anybody getting hurt on your side, right? I mean, there's a lot of balance here. As far as your first question, I don't really know the answer. I ask myself that regularly, but we're not in the room where the strategic decisions are being made in terms of what needs to be done, in terms of how much capability needs to be destroyed of the other side before we achieve, as you described it, a tactical victory, right? So is it the equivalent of a punch in the face, or do we need to have a knockout punch, right? And so this is a huge challenge for states right now with counterterrorism. And what's interesting is you say, why don't we just allow them to be the ones who are seen as unlawful and illegitimate? What's interesting is they are doing that and nobody seems to notice, right? And so do you allow some of your people to die from rocket attacks or suicide bombings because it's going to make the other side look like bad, brutal terrorists? If it was my kid on the bus, that wouldn't be my choice, right? So there's a balance there. States are struggling for that balance, right? So I don't know, maybe that's something your institute can work on here, finding an answer.
We'll get it done this afternoon, yeah.
Yes.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts about Palestine trying to get charges brought against Israel and the ICC, and how that fits into your comments today about how the media can drive who or what is or criminal.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is clearly a very hot topic. Gotten a lot of people in certain areas very busy in the last little while. In the grand scheme of things, I think accountability is critically important. I think that Israel should investigate anybody and any incidents that seem to have gone outside the bounds of the law. I think that Hamas and all of the other groups in Gaza who committed crimes, and it seems, again, firing a rocket unaimed into civilian areas, you don't need a whole lot of information about that one to tell that it's a war crime. But maybe there's information we don't know, right? I mean, those should be investigated. They're not being investigated at all. So on one level, taking this situation and putting it in the hands of the international community potentially has the benefit, of getting that now brought before an international court. One thing that's interesting, when you read a lot of the articles, it talks about the Palestinians suing Israel before the International Criminal Court. It doesn't work that way. Okay, they've accepted the jurisdiction of the court. The court seems to have accepted that they could do that and has opened a preliminary investigation. The prosecutor determines what issues, what crimes, which people. None of the parties have any say in that at all, right? The whole idea of using sued and criminal, right? We all know after a couple of days of law school, you can't put those two together. However, I do think that there's an enormous political undertone here. Enormous. And to the extent that the accountability process is being used as part of a delegitimization game, obviously that's highly problematic. And it's not just problematic for this conflict, it's problematic for the idea of accountability. Because accountability is not a game. Accountability is important. That's how we try to keep atrocities from being committed in the future. So if it becomes a game, then now we start to question every other circumstance where it's being used. I think that we have no choice but to watch and let it play out. I think there's a lot of interesting legal issues. I think that, whether we're looking at jurisdiction questions like complementarity, whether we're looking at questions about whether crimes have been committed, what are the elements of those crimes. With regard to the particular issues that we talked about today, there have been some decisions at other international tribunals that have raised some of these challenges about the ability of international tribunals to hear cases and reach judgments about incidents during military operations, right? As opposed to atrocities where you have crimes against humanity or genocide or other things being committed. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and if the court even decides to take those.
This should be a quick one. It's maybe a clarification question. Running from the premise that a state's primary responsibility is to protect its own people, I'm a political scientist too, but I don't have great knowledge on the legal stuff here. And from your talk, it's evident from what I know before that in war, you're supposed to take steps to protect your enemy's civilian population. To what extent, though, is there a body of law saying that you need to take steps to protect your own civilian population in war? Now, let's bracket the issue that Hamas isn't even really a legitimate government here, internationally recognized, but to what extent could Hamas be prosecuted if you can show they deliberately endangered their own people? It strikes me as highly ironic if international law has has all these provisions that you're supposed to protect others, but says nothing about how you're supposed to protect your own.
Well, the protection is across the board, right? It's not divided by which side civilians are on. And those obligations that I talked about in answer to her question back there about the precautions to protect your own people, those are some of the obligations that a government party has. So, I mean, the obligations to protect civilians are all civilians.
Okay.
So it doesn't really matter, enemy, not enemy, etc. You could look to other bodies of law. I mean, I think there's a fascinating project, if anybody wants a project, to look at what are Hamas's obligations under human rights law to the people in Gaza. I would love to see a really, really good analysis of that, right? They're not a state, but can you have a black hole where there are no human rights? I mean, those people who live there still have the right to life, even if they live in this hard to describe non-state sort of state territory area. So I don't know, maybe somebody wants to take that on, but I think that would be really interesting. But under the law of war, states have to protect civilians from basically from suffering during war. There's lots of ways they do that. We can think about it as when launching attacks. We can think about it as the defending party in the area. And a lot of the obligations towards your own people will stem from human rights law, domestic law also. You'll have additional layers. But you can't you don't like sort of protect one group and throw the rest to the wolves.
Thank you.
Laura, I have the feeling we could go on for a while. We're about to be evicted. That was a terrific talk, lucid, lots of content. Thanks very much for joining us.